I'm gonna have to just go through and hand grade it.
No, I don't want you to do that.
I can't figure out any way around it. I just need to sign
I'll
it.
call IT. Fine. And I'll wait for an hour after.
Actually, I mean, they might be able to unlock it and submit it if they can access the data. So there we go. Yeah. Okay, so screen share. Just give me trust. All right, so a bunch of different things. Today I'm going to review a little bit about data flow diagrams and kind of show how that can tie into an agile process that we're doing. That's because the next thing you're going to do on homework 6 is data flow diagram, like a context diagram. And then you're going to flush out your requirements, which in the case of Scrum is more user stories. So we didn't talk in great deal about them before. I just kind of said, here's the format, here's a couple articles, let's do them. We'll talk a little bit more about them. And then and then Thursday we'll cover more stuff. So I'm starting to get a pretty clear idea on timeline for this, the rest of the project, how this will time out. So homework 6 will be due, and I'll probably get that up tonight. I just didn't quite have time to finish writing it before I came over here because I was getting this other stuff ready. That'll be due the 24th, so you'll have over a week to do it. It's going to be worth a little more points because it's a little more work, I think. But we won't have class next Tuesday, the 22nd. I'll be in Indianapolis for Project Lead the Way Summit. So we just won't have class, and you can just use that to work on that homework 6. And I'll make it due at midnight, the 24th, so if you have questions, you have a last chance to kind of run them by me. That's kind of what I'm doing with all these, is I'll make them due the day of a class, but later, so you have kind of a second or last chance to get clarification. So that will be due the 24th. Then we have one more week before spring break. We'll do another assignment, which will likely be an ER diagram, kind of, and a logical diagram of how you're going to store your data. So that's going to be more difficult for some and less difficult for others, depending if you took databases or not, but we'll kind of work through it. For some of you, you largely probably have it, so it's just a matter of adapting it. So that'll lead us to spring break. I'll put out an assignment before spring break in case you want to do it, but it's not going to be due like right after spring break. You know, I'd rather you just pretty much do nothing, but I know some people would rather just bang it out. I'll be on a bus to Calgary with 20 some high school boys, so that's my spring break in a nutshell.
Plain sight. In case some don't make
My wife's going too, so
Okay.
that sounds a little less. So, no, neither of us are getting paid. So, I'll give an assignment before spring break that'll be due after, that will be user interface mockups. I'm finding some awesome online cloud-based tools for mocking up interfaces. I was like blown away with how good they are. They're wireframe. You just drag everything on, and you can like say, "This is the buttons I need. This is what I want it to look like." It's nicer to do those before you try to go in and code them, because then you kind of have something you're working for it. And then, as we work into the project, if you can't get to all of them by the end, you at least have like screens, you know, that you could show, like this page would look like this if I had time to do it. And if you're doing web or something, you can actually take screenshots of those pages, just kind of embed them on your website where they would be, and then it's almost like they're there, even though they're not. So I haven't looked at online mock-up tools in a while, but there's a bunch of them. that I've been looking at, and I'm pretty impressed with the abilities. Like, they have all the controls here. You can just start dropping in everything you need, buttons, lay them out. There's a few that'll even export this into like HTML5, basically be your interface. So I think I told you guys when we talked about this section of the book, prototyping, that I use PowerPoint slides. You can make links between the slides, how it's awful. This is a million times better. So this is one called Mockups with a Q, but there's a ton of them. I'll find the best one and kind of point you guys that way. Now, if you don't need to mock up because you'd rather just mock it up in programming language, that's fine too. Sometimes, if you're advanced enough at programming, it's easier just to whatever you're going to develop it in, create screens, but don't create the functionality behind the screens. Sometimes people just depend on it. So that would take us to, that would be due like the end of the week after spring break or the beginning of 2 weeks after. If it was due the 12th of April, we'd still have 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks until your prototype would be due. So we would have done our database design, we would have done our user interface mock-ups, we'd have everything, and you'd have a month pretty much just to work towards that end goal of the project. So I think that times out pretty well. So that's kind of where I'm at schedule-wise. So yeah, we'll probably at that point transition into a lot of just lab time. There'll be topics I'll want to talk about as we go, but they'll get shorter and less often than they have been now. So let's talk briefly. I pulled some of the slides from earlier on when I talked about data flow diagrams. We'll just kind of cook through these to refresh our memory. It's been quite a while since we talked about those. I just read this interesting article about how Dropbox used Amazon as their host for like the first 6 years, and then now the last 2 years they've built their own data centers. It's kind of interesting. I mean, they built a huge company with outer infrastructure behind it. It was pretty impressive. So this is chapter 6 in your book. So chapter 5 is about requirements gathering, where to find them, looking at existing documentations, all of that. That doesn't apply as much to this project because they're kind of looking at when you're coming into an existing business. We're kind of creating things from scratch. So when we create our requirements, we'll be doing user stories and those kind of things. But in an agile process, a lot of times it makes a little more sense to almost do reverse. Come up with your data flow and the context of the system, and then write your requirements and user stories off of that. So that's kind of the way I've structured this. So just remember, data flow diagrams are part of this idea called process modeling. So how do we basically diagram everything that goes on within a system? So data flow diagrams is the primary tool for this. They illustrate movement of data between external entities and internal processes and data stores. So the outcomes we talked about, the first is the context data flow diagram. That's the very highest one. It doesn't show the actual data stores, it only shows the highest level view of the system. And then so it's the scope, basically. And then we kind of dig down from there. There's level 0, which is we start showing the individual processes, and then you can break those down and go on until you run out of detail. We're not going to go that detailed. We'll do a context and probably a level 0 of a couple of your key portions. And I was looking at some resources consider context and level 0 to be the same. Some textbooks, some sources because I was looking at online sources versus our textbook. Our textbook differentiated context is the highest, then level 0, then level 1, on and on. So we have these symbols. There's 4 symbols. We have an arrow, which is a flow of data. We have this open-ended rectangle, which is a data store. That's somewhere where we're storing data. Some process that's going on, and then the source and sinks. Those are the inputs and the outputs from the system. So is this kind of ringing a bell? It's been a while. So data flow, that's data that's in motion. It's moving from one part of the system to another. That's an arrow. You give it a name. Data store, that's data at rest. A lot of times it's going to be a database in our cases or those kind of things. But it could be a file folder, some other kind of thing. We're talking here about modeling the whole system of the business. So hopefully you're not planning your online system to hold data on a notebook. That would make sense. So that's an open-ended rectangle, the right vertical line of the system. So you label it, and then they number it too. Process, that's work or actions performed on data. So it's either changing the data, it's going to store the, modify and store the data, or it's going to distribute it somehow. It's a rounded rectangle. Corners are rounded. And again, they number them with names. Source sinks, so that's the origin or the destination of data. So the idea here is that these are external. A lot of times it's going to be users of some kind in our case. Those are our squares. Has a name. The idea here is because they're outside of our control, we're not as concerned with them. As far as data is flowing in the system, yeah, we care about the user, but they're not part of the system. They're just interacting with the system. Here's a couple examples. The top one's a bad example. The bottom one is a good example. The top one shows a process as a source sink. It has let's see. I did the same thing last time. In questioning what happened. So accounting department here is considered a source, but that's internal to the system. That's really a process that they can be doing. I mean, this example doesn't completely apply to us because we're not modeling like a bank, a software system at this point. But the customer here is one, is the source, and then the bank is the same. So specifically the context diagram, which is going to be the first one you're going to do. That's the scope of the organizational system. It shows the boundaries of the system and what the external entities. And again, the external entities in this case are likely going to be just the user, right? They're almost the source and the sink in a lot of these of your projects. Level 0 diagram, that's the next one. That represents the system's major processes, data flows. That's one level more specific than the context diagram. It says it later in the slide. The context diagrams don't have data stores on them. They don't get that specific. The level 0 does. So we looked at this Hoosier burger. This was the food ordering thing. Customer is the source. Kitchen is the sink. Restaurant manager is the sink. So some things are going, and the reason your system's the user is going to be kind of both in a lot of cases, because you're not feeding information to someone else. Here, you're feeding information to the kitchen. That's a totally other outside source. Unless you're passing data on to some other entity, yours will be structured a little differently. But this was the context level, has the boundaries. And then they break this down. They're taking this idea of we're ordering food. And they're saying, okay, here's the level 0, they're point zeros. Here's how the food ordering actually happens. You have to receive the order, pass it to the kitchen, you have to update inventory, you have to update the goods sold. Here's the data that's stored is in this goods sold file. So it's just going more specific. Basically, this one process here is blown up into 4 processes here and 2 data stores. Basic rules that apply to DFDs. Inputs to a process are always different than outputs. So here's the input, the process, it has to change the data or it's not a process. If it's the same thing coming in and out, it's not really a process. Objects have a unique name. They're saying you can repeat certain stores on the diagram and make it uncluttered. I'm not like super tied up into specific rules on these. Here's a bunch more rules. When you go to work on your homework, it would be a good idea to kind of do it and then just double check some of these. A process can't have only outputs. It can't have only inputs. It's a black hole. Data doesn't just jump from one data store to the next. If it was from a file folder to a database, something happened to make it go into the database. It just didn't magically walk there and turn itself into bits and climb into the computer. So data cannot move directly from a source to a sink. I mean, a lot of these are like common sense. What would the system be then if it went from one end to the other? And a whole bunch more about the flows. It can't go to the same process it leaves. You can kind of look through these. I think they're pretty easy. So as far as drawing these, there's some guidelines they give. Completeness. Ideally, it's going to have all the components of the system. This part, we're not going to really worry about, but what they're saying is that if you have something on a diagram, that should be defined in your project dictionary. We're not going to have a project dictionary our use. Consistency, so you don't mix levels in one diagram. If you're going to one level, like a level 1, that detail, it needs to be consistent across. They're just pointing out that don't try to represent time on the diagrams. Just assume it's just continually running and there's no, it takes this long to get from here to here. That's not part of the diagram. And then they're just saying you're going to keep moving on. So, primitive, okay, so that's kind of the rundown to refresh our mind of what these data flow diagrams are. And I put here, see chapter 6 if you want to refresh it. Now, I posted here an article. It's called Data Flow Diagrams, an Agile Introduction. They're talking here about in the 70s, these were introduced. Jane and Sarzan, that's who made those symbols. It was in our book. And they talk about the symbols, and here's enrolling in a university. Here they say on actual projects, it's more common to stand at a whiteboard with one or more project stakeholders and simply sketch as we talk through the problem. That's kind of you with yourself. You're all parts of this. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I'm not gonna like go into too detail, but this is just kind of talking. And then there's some links about this whole website. Agile modeling is about how we model things in agile processes. So I would recommend you just kind of review through this. And then they have some other recommended reading. I posted Lucidchart on here. I'm going to recommend Lucidchart as the tool to do the data flow diagram. Yeah, I can't find anything that's better or easier to use. You know, they say, I didn't get too far into it. When I searched Lucidchart, I wanted to be sure it had the right diagrams. And it's interesting. Their online marketing is also awesome. No matter what you search for in a diagram, they have a landing page that you go to, and they all look the same. But they say like data flow diagram example or flowchart examples. And it kind of flows through, and some of the words are changed, but they're almost exactly the same thing. They're indexed in Google.
And those aren't the DMT symbols.
No, they don't even show the correct symbols. They just have, I mean, probably dozens of these landing pages because I was testing it, like context diagram and all these different terms. I'd open it, it would look just like this. It would just say, whatever is simple with Lucid Chart. But that's ingenious search engine marketing because it, yeah, and it just, all those terms then point to them. So, yeah, I thought that was kind of funny. So, you know, I was like, oh, well, they must have great data flow tools. And I'm like, wait a second, they don't even say anything about it. They show here listed under business that they have data flow diagrams. My assumption is that the symbols are in there. They have like everything. So, okay. Yeah, I spent about 15 minutes trying to remember which account was my educational one for this, and I finally figured it out. So you can sign up for an educational if you want, and then you get a lot more. But for what you need for this, you'd be fine with a free one. But
well, as a student, when I signed up for my
oh, really? When I signed up for mine, whenever we did it in databases, and it's still education. This one's not like the GitHub where you have to wait. It just looks at your .edu and signs you up. So it's so new document. And where is it at in here? Oh yeah, you got rounded. Well, this would be the rounded, not the pillar. Okay, the open-sided. Yeah. Yeah. I don't. I'm sure there's a reason they did that, but it seems like a weird. Why a data store is a sideways rectangle. Yeah. Now, what I will probably, for the homework, I'll have you create your Lucid chart and then link it into your, I'm going to have you put a document in your GitHub that is like other resources and put a link into it. That way there's like a common, or actually, that would make more sense to do on Taiga. A wiki of outside resources. That'd make more sense on Taiga. Make a wiki page that's my other things and put a link to your Lucid chart, and then we do the documentation. I'll have instructions. Now, I jumped right in and totally forgot. I was going to ask about the GitHub and how that was going.
Extremely frustrating.
Okay, you're having a little trouble.
No problem. Desktop does not work like that.
Okay. Well, we'll be done early, and then I'll try to help you. How did it go for everyone else? You get it? Yeah. Yeah, but you were able to do the desktop and the online? Okay. 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 Yeah, I still need to go in and do those things too. So, GitHub, it's one of those things that if it goes smoothly, it's super easy and you kind of get used to it. But if you get off, like I've gotten into some real headaches of like, why can't I get this to do what I wanted to do when I was first learning? So, but I think once you get used to it, and once we start creating source code, we'll start putting it all in there. The thing about, like, I would have had you, if we did a Visio or something, I'd have had you put that in GitHub, the Visio file. But when you're using these online ones, I could have you export PDFs of them and put them in GitHub, because then you'd have every version of when you changed it. That's actually would be a bad idea. Or ER diagrams. Like, V1, well, you wouldn't have to name a V1. You just have every iteration in GitHub. Some of these cloud-based tools have made it, the file sharing advantages and stuff of GitHub have been somewhat lessened because you can just share direct where it's at in the cloud. But for source code and stuff, it's going to be super valuable.
Oh my gosh, you should do it.
Yeah, I wish I'd have had it for my master's, and I actually think, well, like for the computer science program on main campus, they should teach how to use GitHub like day one, because there's no reason you shouldn't put every assignment you ever do in there. It would be so much easier to have all your code in one place and be able to. I mean, I've screwed up so many code projects and not been able to go back to where I wanted because I was too lazy to copy duplicates of the files or different things. So, all right, so Lucid Chart, I think quite a few of us have used that. Now I want to talk a little bit about user stories. I found this slide share, which was pretty good. A few of these pieces we'll skip, but this does a good job of tying together data flow diagrams and how we can use those for user stories and requirements. Requirements generally in Agile and in Scrum are a little more vague and changing than they are. That's the whole idea. We're not saying this is what we're doing and no matter what happens, we're sticking to these requirements because these were checked off by management. You know, they're a little more fluid, but we still have to have them. We can't just start creating something when we don't have any idea where we're going. So, you know, whether some of these statements are true and where they came from, you know, that's, I don't know exactly who Adelina Csci is, but the idea they're saying here is that in the past, development time was always the bottleneck. That's what took forever, and you needed to come up with a way to make the developers faster. Well, this person is arguing that the tools and the processes have come along and made development so much faster that it's usually not the problems. So with faster machines, with better programming languages, the tools to code, and then using Scrum, things like that have increased the speed of development. I mean, I still think development takes the time, but our textbook was adamant that almost all the time was that creation. You know, that's maybe a little dated in today's. So this person is saying the requirements are actually the bottleneck and when you spend more time. They cause the most defects because you come up with the wrong requirements and you spend time creating the wrong thing. You know, again, she's citing these sources that 5% of defects are coming from programming, which means the programmers are writing good code. Most of the errors are because the requirements were wrong and the wrong feature was created. Yeah. And then fixing those requirements errors is a third of the budget. So, I mean, assuming we're taking this as true, you know, like I said, I didn't do a ton of searching out of Hooks and Fairy and all these sources, but getting the requirements right is a key part. So they make a statement here, requirements are not a document, they're a dialogue. That's the idea that it's not something that's just set in stone and doesn't change. It's a conversation between parties, and they're fluid. So here's again just an overview of Scrum. So we have our sprint backlog, which is going to be our big list of user stories. We plan a sprint that goes on for 2 weeks to 30 days, and then we come out with some piece that's shippable. So if we do a Scrum in here, we might be able to do 2 Scrums, right? Like 2 2-week Scrums in that last kind of month. I might break them down and say we'll do 4 1-week Scrums and put you to like really small pieces of functionality. Because then the idea is at the end of those, you have something that works. Rather than working on 30 things and we get to the end and nothing works. I'd rather you have each of those sprints, you have something that's works, because then we're making progress. That follows the Scrum model, is that each sprint you have something you can kind of deliver. Now, of course, at the beginning, you're not going to just make a website with a login and then say, oh, it's deliverable, let's put it out there. You might have to do a couple cycles of it. So, challenges of requirements in Agile. We've looked at great length at the traditional engineering process. So here's a little Dilbert. So give you guys a second, you can read this. So basically, she wants to design the software but needs the requirements. And it's just a circular battle. Like, you need the requirements to do the design, but you don't know what the requirements are until you get into this. This is where Agile methods are better, because you do a little and you gather more requirements and you can kind of keep rolling it. You can kind of prevent this problem because it's much more incremental. Exactly. I wasted time quite a few times in orbital shift thinking I was doing some great feature that a customer wanted, only to find out like that wasn't what they wanted, you know. So, but trying to get them to say what they want. So that was challenge one. Does the business know what it wants? Now again, for your project, you're the business, so hopefully you kind of know what you want. But challenge two is working software over comprehensive documentation. So here's traditional requirements. I mean, I guess I said set in stone, right? They're on a stone tablet here versus napkins or the Agile requirements. So just because you're doing Agile doesn't mean you can just throw out requirements, but it means you successively elaborate requirements. So the idea is that some of these, they're just good enough. You have some user stories and requirements that are good enough to get the gist, and then you might refine those into more specific ones that at that next stage will be just good enough. You don't try to take those down to the exact level of detail before you start coding. That it just doesn't work out well. You end up wasting a lot of time on stuff that probably gets thrown down and changed down the road, or gets thrown out. Challenge three, they're just talking about geographically distributed teams, so you don't have that problem. But if you had a whole bunch of developers working all over, which is the case all the time now, you kind of have this fight. You do need enough detail that everybody knows what they're doing and not working on different ideas, but you don't want so much detail that you're wasting time. So, I mean, here's just some ideas of how to get around these. These aren't as applicable to us. They're saying an analyst and designers can kind of work a sprint in front of the development team, so they can create the UI and kind of mock it up, which shows the features usually, whether it works or not. Making it work is the hard part. Doing the UI and all that is not as difficult if you mock it up. So some people can go ahead and kind of do a little mini sprint. This is kind of what I'll have you do, because you're going to mock it up using a tool to prototype it and then go back and kind of develop to that. So best practices to gather requirements. This is where it becomes pretty relevant to your next homework assignment. Half of your assignment will be the data flow diagram. Half will be requirements, which is you really making user stories. So they've got 4 steps in here. So capture the big picture. First step here, data flow diagram. So that keys in well to what we're doing. So the data flow diagram is used to visualize the flow of data in a given context. So, I mean, here they're saying you can use it to design existing business process. We talked about that before. You make some diagrams to show what they're doing and some for what you want to move it to doing. You're just going to have half of that, but can define the roadmap of where you're going. You're at a high level saying, these are the inputs, these are the outputs, these are the things that are going on. They're saying you can misapply it by drilling down into more and more data flow diagrams at lower levels of detail. Again, these are moving targets, so that just good enough thing kind of applies to all these layers. Tool, whiteboard, case, Visio, Lucid chart would be ours. So here's just an example. This is a little different symbols than our book used, but the idea is there. They still have the squares for the sources and the sinks, the web shop, the warehouse, the customers. The circles in this case are the processes. That was the rounded rectangles. They still have the arrows, and then these aren't really data. I'm not exactly sure how invoices, not exactly sure the symbol process they're using here, but well, you don't have data stores on your data flow diagram. That's only on the lower levels on your context diagram. So this is context. Yeah, but this is more specific. I don't know. Don't get too caught up with this particular image because we're going to go with kind of what we learned. So identify use cases. You can actually create use case diagrams, and I've been debating, do I want you to create these? Basically, a use case, have you guys ever done these in any courses? We did these in CS. It's this idea of you have the actors, they're the users of the system, and then what their goal is. So the easiest way to look at it is just to look at the diagram. So you have the user, what do they want to do? They want to log in. They want to create a member account. They want to view their account. Inside viewing account, it can be extended with some of these other pieces. An administrator is also a user. They want to disable account. So I've done these sometimes. I think they can be helpful. It gives you another view of who are the actors. You know, who are the users of the system? What are their goals? What do they need to do? I think we'll probably skip this because our scope is not such that we need to spend time on it. You'll kind of figure that out through your user stories. Step 3 here, they're saying model a little bit ahead, so focus on an individual use case. And I mean, this is where it does kind of help. You have a user and they want to log in. That's one thing we can focus on. We have a user, we want to be able to create a member account. We're not going to do any of these diagrams. These are another level. I mean, you can diagram and diagram and diagram. I mean, now that I'm thinking about this and the whole pickup thing, maybe I will have you do a basic use case diagram. I just don't want to waste time. Sometimes I spend more time on dealing with the tool and making the diagram than the data that's actually putting out, and that's what I want to avoid for you guys. But this is probably pretty easy in Lucid chart to do, I would guess, but I'll think a little more on that. So these other diagrams we can kind of skip. I mean, they're talking about this is something you show a business, like this is a doctor's office, an illness recurs, it's sent to the doctor, appointment. It's something you can show to the business you're creating for and make sure it jives with how they actually do things. Data modeling diagram, we're not going to do, well, we will do an ER diagram, which is sort of a form of a data modeling diagram. What you find a lot with Agile is they have a lot of the things we've talked about. They just call them something a little different, and they have a little different look, but they're very similar. So this is really like what an ER diagram is. I mean, it says relationships and entities, entity relationship diagram. So State diagrams, these are useful too, but we're not going to do them. State diagrams show like the states of a system. And this is the state diagram of application releases. It's not a very great, anyway, we'll see. And then step 4 here is the prototyping, so mock-ups. You can document the navigation, usability, look and feel without investing time and money to develop the whole project. So this is where this balsamic mock-ups is one of them. iRides, there's dozens of them. So just to kind of cook back through these 4 steps, you're going to do the data flow diagram. You might do a basic couple of use cases. We're going to kind of skip model 3. You're going to do mock-ups. I'm kind of modifying their process. You're going to do mock-ups after you do user stories. So they kind of didn't stick that right in here, but you'll use your data flow diagram and your use case to say, okay, if someone needs to log into the system, a user needs to be able to log into the system so they can use the system. Right? So you'll break those down. I feel like that was really disorganized, but that's what happens when you use someone else's slide that's like 80% exactly what I wanted and 20% not what I wanted. I should have just cut it up, but it's just when they're already in here and it's like done so well. But you get the gist. So that's requirements, engineering, and agile. And then there's 3 more articles. Let's take a quick look here. These are all about requirements in Scrum. Identifying user stories. You can read through this in more depth because it'll help you kind of narrow down. I know some of you had a little trouble, like, how do I make these user stories? And I was purposely vague. We did not really go into it. But it says here, the first and most important step in producing the product backlog is to identify the user stories. So remember, the product backlog, we build up all the user stories, we pick some of those, and we move them into a sprint. That's kind of how the Scrum process works. So it says, in any project of non-trivial size, there are tens or hundreds of user stories. I mean, you can think about it, there'd be a lot for Microsoft Word. There'd probably be thousands. Depends with every little feature you can do. User needs to be able to change the font size. There's hundreds of them. So here, they suggest this idea of business process mapping. Again, we're not going to actually do that, but just thinking of it in this context, it's very much like a use case diagram. A person places an order. They receive an order. The system does. It's confirmed. You can kind of, these are the processes the business goes through. How do we break that down into user stories? So here's a mail order company. They have 3 major processes: order placing, shipping, and invoicing. Each has 2 major steps: receiving the order, converting the order, et cetera, et cetera. They're saying if you take these processes and you identify the actors, so the actors they have are customer, a sales agent, you can then break those down. As a customer, when looking at a product on the web page, I want to place an order for it directly on the web. So you're taking this process and you're breaking it into a user story. There'd be more user stories. Here's a different actor, a sales agent. They also want to be able to order. They get an order over the phone from a customer and they want to input it into that same process. And then, of course, once it's received, there'd be user stories, the confirmation, there'd be more and more and more. So that use case diagram is kind of like taking this and applying the actors into it. And again, there's like a million ways to do a lot of these things. So here they say the first draft of the product backlog can be produced by creating a project backlog item from each of the user stories. So that's, you'll add the user stories. And then here they say this is the idea of the just good enough. It would be naive to just bring that backlog to a sprint planning meeting and think that it's well defined enough to be able to work with. So it starts in the backlog as just good enough, and then when you go to do the sprint, you'll break those down more specifically. Non-functional requirements, so these would be, these are ones that don't fit the user story format, like the web application should take no more than 100 milliseconds to render. These are kind of a little bit outside of the scope of user stories, yet still are things we want to create, right? So you can kind of read through here. They talk about adding requirements, because inevitably, and that's the whole reason you do Agile, you'll develop some and you'll realize, well, I need this. How do we insert that in the process? So this is kind of the end thing. Don't forget requirements. With Scrum being so focused on productivity of the developers, it is easy to forget the requirements phase. Just because we found a great way to get developers productive doesn't mean that we can ignore the requirements. I like how these articles, though, kind of talk, I feel like they're talking down about developers. We finally found a way to take these loser developers and make them productive. The other one sounded the same way to me, too, but maybe I just take offense as a developer. Because that's what feeling I always got in the software company, is everything was always my fault as the developer. So that's the first article. The second one is called Write a Great User Story. So this gives you some guidelines of how to create these user stories. It represents a small piece of business value that a team can deliver in an iteration. While traditional requirements try to be as detailed as possible, a user story is defined incrementally in 3 stages. The brief description of the need, conversations that happen during backlog, grooming, and iteration planning, the test that's confirmed. That's the just good enough. Starts brief, it'll get more broke down for the sprints, and then ultimately the testing. So they have this INVEST acronym. A user story should be independent. It should not require that, well, to do this, I also have to do these 3 other user stories. It should be kind of its own thing. It's negotiable. So, again, avoiding the details, so if it needs to change, you haven't kind of pinned that down. This is what it is. Valuable, why do it if there's not value to somebody? Either the user of the system, the customer, your team is having to maintain the system. Estimatable, so that gets back to that point system in Taiga, right? Is it a 20-point item? Is it a 40-point item? Small. So saying, I want to create a website so I can sell products online. I mean, that's, as a user, I want to, to be able to go to this website and buy products. That's huge, right? That's like creating a whole system. It has to be broken down more specifically. And then testable. So you should be able to say, like, is this accepted? Can we do a test to say, yes, this is done and it works? I'm a little less concerned about testing at this point, because that's just going to be on the scope of the class. Why use user stories? So these are good. Keep yourself expressing value. Avoid detail too early. Avoid the appearance of false completeness, thinking you know exactly what it should be before you really do. And then they give some examples. As a consumer, I want shopping cart functionality to easily purchase items online. So that would be an acceptable chunk. They talk about detail. You can kind of read through this on your own. Too broad, a team member can view iteration status. That's not specific enough. A team member can view a table of stories with rank, name, size, package owner, and status. That's too detailed. It's specifying all the individual pieces. Somewhere in the middle, A team member can view the iteration stories and their status with main fields. Don't try to assume you know what the main fields are. State that they exist. You know there's going to be some main field, but don't pin it down. And then, when do I add details? Well, that'll come as you move forward through the process. Here are some mistakes: too formal, too much detail. Technical tasks masquerading as stories. That comes into, and it comes up, I think, in this other article, having like really development team tasks as user stories that aren't. Those may be things you need to do, and you probably should track those somewhere, but they're not user stories. They don't add value to the user. They don't fit the criteria of these. Last article, and this one kind of goes on and on, but has a lot of good content in it. Your best agile user story. So they have some, we kind of just hit the bullet points. They should be short and sweet. And then they kind of dig into that. Start right, end right. Knowing what you don't know yet. That's kind of the, don't say what the main fields are. You know they're going to exist, but you don't know yet. Here they talk about you can storyboard these. We're not going to do that, but they talk about this idea, which you'll see come up quite a bit. It's called an epic. An epic is like a set of user stories that together kind of form a bigger chunk. I like your definition better. We're not going to do epics, but just that term you'll see out there a lot for Agile. So here you can kind of read there. Here's the Bill Wake, again, talking about this invest, mnemonic, so the independent, they break this down. Here's an example of Spotify. This is a good screenshot. Skateboard, scooter, bike, motorcycle, car. You don't try to like start with a wheel, then go to 2 wheels, then a car without a steering. Like, you want to be incremental with it and independent. They can ship a skateboard. They can ship a scooter. They can skip a bike. Or ship. Did I say skip? Ship a bike. Yeah, they read it. Here they actually make a statement. User stories are not requirements. They were meant to replace requirements, which suck. There's a lot of truth to that. They are requirements still in some way. It just depends on the lens. Some people will say, no, they're not requirements just like this. But, I mean, ultimately, they're part of the process of figuring out what you're going to do. The value, a nice bow. Here is a good example. Developers often have an inclination to work on only one layer at a time and get it right, but a full database layer has little value without a presentation layer. If you make a user story and we need to create the database, what's the value? Yeah, that has to exist in order for the system to work. But how can you tie that into something that goes all the way up and can give value? And then here's the estimatable. Small, they need to be small so that you can go through them, they need to be testable. And then here they have 5 failures. And again, a lot of these are listing failures, right? Because it is always an option. So these are kind of larger failures in terms of the whole process. And then here they have some examples. So here they have Epic 1, and kind of you have this story. As the HR manager, I want to create a screening quiz so that I can understand whether I want to send possible recruits to the functional manager. Then it's broken down. And they have test cases lists with them. If you're going to be able to browse existing quizzes, etc., test cases are, it needs to be possible to search by quiz. And search by quiz topic. So they're actually extending this to stories and test cases. and then you'd have more epics, which would each be broken down. So this is a pretty good article. I mean, they're all good articles that I posted. I would post junk. So I felt like I just blabbed on and on about stuff, but refreshing our memory about data flow diagrams, how that fits within the requirements phase, and which is user stories in our Scrum process that we're going to do. And then this will lead right into the homework. Create a data flow diagram, and I'll specifically say a context diagram, and a level 0 of the key portions of your system that warrant one more level of detail. We're not going to go crazy with it. Using the data flow diagrams and kind of your idea of what the system is going to do, I'm going to have you create, I don't know, probably 20 user stories. I think is a good place to start. I kind of do like that epic thing. If you want to organize them into, here's an epic and this is 5 user stories and this is epic 2. I think that's a good way to kind of help you order your list, because it's kind of like these 5 and I have something pretty good, these 5 and I have something pretty good. I'm not going to pin you to that, but you might consider using the epics just for your own benefit. So the user stories will go into Taiga. The data flow diagrams will go into Lucidchart, unless you have a real itch to use Visio or something. You can do that and put them into GitHub. Remember, the idea is that every deliverable is going to either be in GitHub, Taiga, or it's going to be like a deliverable piece of software that I can test. So run past all these around. All right, good. I probably won't have nearly as much to talk about on Thursday. I'll go over the homework formally of what exactly I typed. I'll probably point out a few things, and then I can help you get started if you want on that part of